When we talk about India, a country with so much going on, have you ever stopped to ask a really basic question? What actually is the law? It sounds simple, right? But the answer? Well, it's got a lot more layers than you'd expect. And to really get it, we need to dive into a real case that pulls back the curtain on how our legal system actually works.
So to get us started, picture this. It's a real scenario that went all the way to the Supreme Court. A big pharma company gives a doctor a shiny new laptop. They call it a gift, to help promote their stuff. Now, we all have our own feelings about whether that's right or wrong, but the legal question is what matters here. Is that act illegal?
You might think it's a simple yes or no, but it's not. And honestly, digging into why it's so complicated is the key to understanding the entire hidden machinery of Indian law. It really makes us think hard about what it means when we say something is prohibited by law. So here's our game plan. Think of it like we're building a pyramid. We'll start with the base, the most common idea of law. Then we'll add the next layers, ordinances, rules, and regulations. We'll also figure out how to spot things that look like law but aren't. And then we'll bring it all back to solve our pharma freebie puzzle. Okay, Section 1, the foundation. When most of us think about the law, our minds usually jump to one thing. These big, formal documents passed by the people we elect. And you know what? That's a great place to start. The most obvious building blocks of our legal system are acts. Things like the National Medical Commission Act or the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. They're passed by Parliament or state legislatures. This is the foundation of our legal pyramid for sure. But here's the kicker. It is nowhere near the whole story.
So let's move on to Section 2 and build on that. To really get what law means in India, you've got to go right to the source code, the ultimate rule book for the country, the Constitution. And it turns out it has a much, much wider definition of law.
And here it is. This is where things get really interesting. Article 13 of the Constitution says, hey, law isn't just about acts. It says law includes all this other stuff: ordinances, orders, rules, regulations, notifications. This one sentence just blows the definition wide open. So let's break some of these down.
First up, the ordinance. Think of this as a kind of emergency law. When Parliament isn't meeting, but something urgent needs to be done right now, the government can issue an ordinance. A perfect example, the Epidemic Diseases Ordinance from 2020. Remember the height of COVID. Things were changing by the hour. That ordinance was passed super quickly to give the government new powers and to protect our healthcare workers. The main thing to remember is that they're temporary. They have an expiry date and have to get Parliament's stamp of approval to stick around for good.
Okay, this brings us to Section 3. And this is where it gets really fascinating, because this is the stuff most of us never see. It's the world of delegated legislation. Let's be real. Parliament can't write every single tiny rule for every industry. It's just not possible. So what an act often does is delegate, or hand off, the power to make more detailed laws to other groups.
Now, two of the biggest ones you'll see are rules and regulations, and you've got to know the difference. Generally, rules are made by the government itself. They deal with things like procedures, appointments, how a commission is going to work. Regulations, on the other hand, are usually made by an expert body that the act creates, like the National Medical Commission. And this just makes perfect sense, right? Let the technical experts at the NMC make the very specific technical regulations about medicine, because they know that world inside and out.
So we have acts, ordinances, rules, and regulations. Got it. But wait, there's more. Not everything that comes out of a government office and looks official is actually law in the strict sense. And knowing how to tell the difference, that's a superpower. Let's draw that line in the sand. Okay, this is a really big one. On one side, you have law. It's binding. It creates rights and duties that you can actually enforce in a court. Think of the National Food Security Act. It gives people a legal right to food. On the other side, you have policies and schemes, like the National Health Policy or Ayushman Bharat. Now, these are super important. They tell you what the government's goals are, but they aren't law. You can't sue the government for not following a policy because it doesn't create a right you can enforce in court.
All right, let's put this to the test. Here's a classic example, the Hippocratic Oath. Every doctor knows it. It's a powerful guide for how they should behave. But here's the question, is it legally binding? Could you take a doctor to court for breaking it?
And the answer is no. The Hippocratic Oath is a profoundly important moral code, but it is not law. However, and this is the really critical part, the Indian Medical Council's Code of Conduct regulations, those absolutely are law. Why? Because they're a form of delegated legislation created by an expert body with power given to them by an act of Parliament. And if you violate those, you can face very real legal consequences.
And that brings us right back to where we started.
So for our last section, let's take everything we've just figured out and finally solve the puzzle of the pharma company, the doctor, and that free laptop. This is where it all comes together.
So how did the Supreme Court crack this case? Well, they used the exact same pyramid of logic we just built. Step 1. They looked at the Medical Council's ethics regulations and asked, are these law? Yes, they are delegated legislation. Step 2. What do these regulations, this law, say? They clearly prohibit doctors from taking freebies. And that leads to the brilliant final step. If a pharma company gives a doctor a freebie, it's helping the doctor do something that is prohibited by law. The conclusion? You can't get a tax deduction for an expense you made while helping someone else break the law. Simple as that.
And this quote from the judgment just nails it. It says it all. One arm of the law cannot be utilized to defeat the other arm of law. You can't use tax law to get away with something that medical regulations forbid. The whole legal system has to work together. Otherwise, as the court said, it would be opposed to public policy.
So we end on this thought. We've seen how a regulation, written not by our elected MPs in Parliament, but by a group of technical experts, can have the full force of law. It can literally define what is illegal and have huge financial impacts, which leaves us with a pretty deep question to think about. What does this all mean for the balance of power in our country between the experts and the officials we elect to make the rules that shape all of our lives?